So I'm very happy to introduce the last session. It's the last session of the day and also the last session of the workshop. So we made it through a really incredible number of papers. And in this session, we will have three speakers. Sean is the first one, and Sean Coughlin is the PI of the project Alchemies of Scent, which is based at Prague at the Karls University, and he has a very interdisciplinary team, but we have already heard several things about Sean, and now he will talk to us about Styrax, Storax, and Stacte, and all the difficulties in terminology and confusions that are kind of circling these terms. So Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you especially to the organizers for all of their work putting this fantastic event together, and for all of the speakers here and in the audience. It's been really enriching, and I love coming back to Łódź, so thank you. I want to ask a question, and the question is, I don't know how many people had this question before, it's not super common, but the question is, what is Styrax? Because we are having a really hard time, and maybe some of you can help us. Now, this is something that you can buy, but what is it? Where does it come from? How did we come to think we knew? Dioscorides describes this, and here you can see a picture from Mattioli. He describes this as something coming from a quince-like tree, and that tree has come to be called Styrax officinalis, and it's a real thing. But the evidence that this tree produces a resin that you can use in sufficient amounts for any purpose is not at all conclusive. And there are almost no published reports on this stuff. You will find no one who's actually going to be able to prove to you that they've seen it. And yet from antiquity to the present, this identification has been accepted. Now, I'm going to say quickly and pass around some scents so you guys can smell the differences between these things. I bought Styrax from a couple of different places, and I never get the same thing. I always get a different product. And so Laura's going to pass around a couple of different scents while I'm talking. Often what you'll find on the market is resin from Liquid Amber Orientalis. You can see its native range in that small little region of southwestern Turkey. And Styrax officinalis rather has a broader range that fits much better with the way it's talked about in antiquity, about where the stuff was found, depending on who you read. But just to say that also Styrax officinalis is something that still people will promote as the source of these resins that we're buying. Nothing you'll smell today comes from Styrax officinalis, but it comes from many other things. The first thing that is being passed around as a Styrax, but from Asia. This is, I think it's a Styrax benzoin. It's a resinoid, and this is the benzoin comes from Luban Java. So this is the Javan Luban, and Luban is just the Arabic word for incense. And the other one you're going to smell is from Liquid Amber Orientalis, and then you're going to smell something that was sold to me as Turkish sweet gum, and it smells like toluene. And then you're going to smell, or styrene, which is also one of the products that were taken from the Styrax tree, hence the name, styrene. And then you're also going to smell some of the commercial stuff that you can buy, which is basically pieces of charcoal with some scented stuff in it. And we have no idea where this comes from or what the process is. So if anyone knows how these things are actually made, if anyone's ever been to a processing, like these charcoal processing centers, I'd love to hear. This isn't really what I'm up to today, though. I'm just showing you this stuff. Now, Styrax isn't just a curiosity. Styrax, if you read the historians anyway, it was something that was absolutely essential across so many different cultures. It was essential in ritual, in religious rituals, in medicine, and in commerce. And there's something important here. That is, if you don't have it, you can't make all of the things that you need to do religion, to do medicine, or to sell things. So without it, you can't make not only the kifi, or you can't make certain other medications from the Ebers papyrus, but you also can't keep the gods alive. And if you don't have it, then there are a whole bunch of medicines that you can't get, and so a whole bunch of diseases you can't cure. So there's always something that's going to be called Styrax, simply because you couldn't admit that you don't have it. And so we find it, though, where for historians through all of these different cultures, we find Nenib in Egyptian is translated as Styrax. Libana, Nataf, and Zori in the Hebrew Bible are translated as Styrax. In the Septuaginta, Styrax is translated as Styrax. Virgil, Pliny, and Scribonius talk about a Storax or a Styrax. Again, we call it Styrax. Edfu has a bunch of things, and Athribis, 2 temples in Egypt, have a bunch of things in temples that are called woods, but we translate them as Styrax. And it goes on and all the way up to Simon of Genoa, who people translate Maya, Storax, Stacte, and another plant called Stygia, all as Styrax. So we just have a complete collapsing of a linguistic range with no apparent explanation, except for the one I'm going to try to go through today. Now, one of the first scholars to point out that there's a problem with Styrax was Jan Jacob Kirsten, who in 1736 wrote, "Since I am inclined to test, in so far as my abilities allow, what I can accomplish in explaining the history of Styrax, I undertake this endeavor, though I seem to be entering a nearly inextricable labyrinth, one in which even the most perceptive men equipped with every available aid have long labored and sweated and have scarcely discovered the Ariadnean thread they sought." Now, following in Kirsten's footsteps, a series of pioneering studies, botanist Daniel Hanbury in the 1800s, have become the basis for the modern story. Now, Hanbury crystallized a narrative about Styrax that goes something like this. In antiquity, there was a product that was on the market that was sold as something called Styrax in Greek, and that comes from a plant called Styrax officinalis these days, and that's the plant Dioscorides told us about. But that species eventually stopped producing a resin, because why not? And as it did, it was gradually replaced by another resin of another tree with a similar exudate, that is the Liquidambar orientalis. And Hanbury did this by starting from ancient evidence and descriptions and trying to reconstruct the history of this resin. And in fact, this is how scholars normally work. They usually go forward in time, starting from the past, like Theophrastus or Herodotus or Dioscorides, or even earlier in Egypt, and then tracing their influence in the adoption of their views. And many still think that the resin of Styrax officinalis is available on the market through this kind of thinking. But like Kirsten's labyrinth, this often leads to dead ends or unresolvable ambiguities. So what I want to do today is take a bit of a different backwards method. You know, like when I was a kid, I would always cheat on mazes, and you always start in the middle, you know, and then figure out how to get back out. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to start where we end up, and we're going to end back in the past somewhere. So we're going to begin with a modern assumption that Styrax is the resin of Styrax officinalis and see how we got there. I'm going to show you just a couple of observations. And these observations are what I call the authority trap, the universe illusion, the interpretive inertia of Styrax, and the substance fallacy. And by the authority trap, what I mean is that, you know, these texts are our starting point, so we privilege them. But as a result, it really becomes hard to question their descriptive accuracy. We need to rely on Dioscorides, but Dioscorides might have been wrong, or the text might have gotten corrupt. And so, in a sense, we're in an epistemological knot. The second is the universe illusion. People who grew up liking science fiction or fantasy know how important it is to tell a complete, cohesive, coherent story about the universe that they are embedding in their imagination. And people who are historians often live in the same kind of a fantasy world, where the whole ancient world shared a unified taxonomy and practice, like characters say in the Marvel comic universe, right? So even in narrow periods of antiquity, the names and substances actually shifted quite quickly across time and place. But because we want to believe that the Egyptians and the Hebrews and the Christians and everyone was worshiping using the same kind of sacred materials, we tend to see this stuff everywhere. Another problem is interpretive inertia. So that, you know, once an interpretation gets promoted, it's really hard to get it back. And this is the case with Styrax. And finally, we have a kind of what I like to call the substance fallacy. So we're looking for a stable botanical referent, but many things aren't identified this way, or they're not individuated this way. It's rather their functional or ritual role or their symbolic value that's important. So it'd be kind of like trying to identify the Eucharist by what species of wheat was used to make it. Maybe trying to find what wine was used in a Catholic Mass, and you start asking, well, what's the bloodiest tasting wine? I mean, that would be a really silly way, but people kind of approach many of these compounds in a similar way. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of examples. I don't have any positive answers to this stuff. I'll give you a little bit about how we approach these questions, but I have no idea what Storax or Styrax is. So the authority trap, and I'm going to start with a recent study by Susanna Meig, just to show how people kind of just continue to repeat old stories over and over again. And I picked Susanna Meig because she's a fantastic scholar, because she's very thorough, and because her work is still quite influential. Now, Susanna Meig cautiously in this paper on the Styrax et ses usages antiques, cautiously accepts that Styrax at one point was a resin from Styrax officinalis, although she tends to favor liquid ambar orientalis as an ancient resin. But why does she accept Styrax officinalis? Because it matches his Dioscorides note that it has similarity to the quince. We find Amig, when she discusses the kind of conundrum, and I think this is always important, refers to some studies in her footnotes, and this is really where all the arguing takes place in most articles. And when we go to her footnotes, first we find that she offers some citations from various 17th, 18th century people who have seen Styrax producing a resin as an argument for how it stopped at some point and what our last evidence was. And she points to Flückiger and Hanbury, who wrote a great work on the Pharmacopoeia. And in this work, if we just kind of follow this footnote, we find that the story here exists, that we have Styrax referring to two different substances known from a remote period, one Styrax officinalis and the other liquid ambar, and that there are some hints that Styrax was producing up until the 18th century, but in most localities, they say it has now been reduced by ruthless lopping to a mere bush, the young stems of which yield not a trace of exudation. True Storax has thus utterly disappeared. Now, it's interesting to think what true Storax means in this case. But actually, when you look at Amig and who she's citing, it's clear that she's not only thinking of Flückiger and Hanbury's Pharmacographia. Actually, she's probably read Dan Hanbury's other work, because the same 18th century writers that she cites are cited in that study. And there we find Hanbury actually citing two authors or two witnesses to the resin, one of whom was Duhamel de Monceau, 1755, and this is in his footnote. So he writes that Monceau had found some Styrax resin growing in the Chartreuse de Montreuil, and he asked his friend, Dr. Planchon in Montpellier, to go check out those trees and see if he could find any resin flowing from them. And Planchon went and he incised the trees in the summer, in the heat of the summertime, trying to get something to happen. And as Hanbury writes, the experiment was unsuccessful. Neither aqueous sap nor resinous juice flowed from the incisions. So Planchon was unable to replicate Duhamel de Monceau's observations. But let's see what Monceau writes. So Monceau is writing in 1755, and this is the record of his observation. He says, I found in Provence, near the Chartreuse de Montreuil, on large Alibouffier trees, these are the Styrax officinalis trees, rather considerable outflows of a fragrant balm. It seemed to me beyond doubt that these produce Storax. Nevertheless, if one consults what we said in our article on liquid ambar, you can't help but conclude that the latter also produces it. So here we actually find Monceau kind of hedging a little bit. I don't really know quite how to interpret what he's saying. He says that he found it near a monastery. I think it's interesting that the two 18th century reports of Styrax come from stands of trees growing next to monasteries where the resin might have actually been used. I'm not really sure what to say about it, but this is the kind of evidence that Hanbury is referring to when he talks about the resin's observation. And it's simply two. Now, when Duhamel de Monceau introduces Styrax, he introduces it as the Styrax of Linnaeus. This is the Styrax that Linnaeus called officinale. And he assigns this name officinalis, right, of the pharmacy, but where does he get that association for it? Well, he mentions here a Styrax with leaves like the quince apple, and that comes from Caspar Bauhin, who is writing about 100 years before Linnaeus, who is the author of a kind of authoritative Renaissance catalog of plants. And when we look at Caspar Bauhin's description, we find that he cites Mattioli as the source for the Styrax folio malicotonii. And when we look at Mattioli, who is writing in, this is the 1554 Venice edition of the commentary on Dioscorides, we find Mattioli say, the tree of the Styrax is, as Dioscorides says, very similar to quince, as much in size as in shape. Styrax trees grow not only in gardens in many parts of Italy, but also spontaneously around Rome, toward Marino and Tivoli, although these do not yield Styrax resin. So I don't think Mattioli has actually seen Styrax resin coming from a tree. It's a strange thing that he said. Alain might be able to correct me, but I'd be very interested. Here, where does all of this lead us right now? What started all of this was not only a description of a tree like quince, but we have no credible observations of resin production. And from leaves like quince, that's all it took for us to identify this resin is coming from this tree, even though no one's seen it. So that leaves us with questions. What if Dioscorides made an error or described a plant that had no connection to the material? We're not really sure. Part 2. This is a paper that we're working on right now, which is about Nenib, an Egyptian term that has been described as Styrax. And this is a story about what happens when we assume cultural continuity across vastly different traditions. So we were in Atribis, which is a temple, a little while ago, and we see these beautiful trees, which some botanists have identified for us as most likely not Styrax officinalis or liquid amber orientalis. Nevertheless, people, namely Chamet and Goyon, have identified the resin described in these soubassements as Storax. And the reason they do this, they claim, is because of a study that was done by Victor Loret, writing about 100 years before them. And they write, the gamme résine de liquid amber orientalis, identifié pour la première fois par Loret. Let's go check out Loret. Loret says, based on the information provided by ancients about Styrax, it is certain that it came from Styrax and not from liquid amber. This is an interesting confusion that Chamet and Goyon have gotten into, and this has been pointed out already by Suzanne Amig in her article. And the question is, so why did Loret think that it must be Styrax? He gets into a lot of discussion about it, but ultimately he's taking his starting point from a work that came out just a bit before by Heinrich Brugsch in the Hieroglyphic Demotic Dictionary. And he identifies Nenib with the biblical Libne, and hence with Styrax via some Greek translations. And he's making the connection simply based on the linguistic form. So ne is the same as le. So this is, I mean, a linguistic can take this apart for me, but I think this wouldn't stand up to modern scrutiny. This is simply too implausible. It's not just Brugsch. Actually, we can go back to Simon of Genoa, and we can see that he picks up the same thread, but through the idea of a drop, where we have Simon of Genoa equating Stacte and another thing called Sigia and Buta and all of these with Styrax, and actually claiming that Stacte, which Dioscorides and other authors claim is an exudate of Myrrh, or at least a product of Myrrh, is in fact Storax, and he's using biblical evidence. And this has been picked up as well recently in the last 40 years by Zohari, who claims that the biblical nataf, so the ingredient in the Ketor, the sacred incense, is in the taf in Hebrew, which the Septuaginta translates as Stacte, but he claims is in fact Styrax. And the evidence of Lagarde, who identified this simply here in one note. He basically says, I think Styrax is Greek for tsori. And this is also explained in a note in the Talmud, where we find Rabbi Shimon saying tsori is nothing but a resin from the balsam trees when interpreting what the nataf word means in that passage from Exodus. So we have this kind of now interpretive inertia going. The echo of the tradition continues that all of these terms mean Styrax. I'm just going to go through a couple of examples of this appearing in the scientific literature, and I hope Bara will just let me get through this, and then I'll be finished. We find Victor Gika in an article writing about the Coptic term equivalent for Styrax, appealing to a work by Post. Sorry, what was interesting about Gika's article, and I can't quite see it here in that small little thing, but he says the region where this resin is exuded from, it's exuded by incisions made in the tree. And he cites Post 1933, but when we read Post 1933, there's no evidence of any incisions in this little article. He just says the officinal Styrax is the insipated juice of the bark. And so he's somehow conjuring an image that he's already seen and then reading it into something as he's citing the source, very similar to what happens in the scientific literature. So here we have most recent review article on Styrax. And in this review article, they claim that there have been analyses of Styrax resin, and they cite this paper. But in this paper, basically, if you look at what solvents and reagents and what resinous substances they use, you won't find any Styrax officinalis in here. And so we have this continuing over and over again. The same thing by Margaret Serpico, who claims to have used this study as for evidence for Styrax officinalis. And when you look at that study itself, which is this from the Journal of Chromatography by Mogduno and Colombini, the samples that they claim to use are Styrax benzoin and liquid amber orientalis, but no Styrax officinalis. And actually, you won't find anyone who's offering, except for 2 articles. I'm going to end there. I do have a theory on what's going on, and I have some notes about what we're doing. If anyone's ever seen Styrax officinalis, I would be very interested. But I just want to conclude with one thing about how we approach authority, both ancient and modern. And I would just implore people to follow the footnotes back as far as you can go and find out why someone said something before repeating it. And I'll leave with this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sean. And our next speaker is Laura. Laura is a chemist, and she is currently a PhD student at the Alchemy of Scent research project in Prague. And she's also working on a number of different recreations and interpretations. And in her talk, The Impossible Challenge of Reconstructing Ancient Perfumes, she might also conclude what we have heard just in the last session. And so, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. So, good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for the nice introduction. I would like to start with something that it's kind of familiar for all of you, and try to reconstruct some ancient technologies or also the different experience and techniques. So many of you, for example, try to experiment or try to recreate some seasoning cooking recipes. Others try to recreate or bringing back some luxury fabrics, even also try to replicate different medicinal recipes. And also, like us, for example, to working on reconstruction of perfumes from ancient Greek and Roman Egypt. And that's what I want talking about that today. So I want to show you why, in my opinion, it's kind of impossible, this kind of task. But if we still try, that's a really important thing. When if we still try doing a reconstruction, we could have some very interesting insights and very interesting feedback that we just always learning from it. So I want to start with explaining why I think it's impossible, and basically because there is 2 main reasons. That's why. And first one, it's kind of obvious. I think so. All the perfumes are already gone, and the people who made it also, it's gone. So even though with all the technology we have right now, it's we still to relay in our own judgment or in our own memories to judge a smell of the perfume when it's good or when it's bad. So, and also the other reason that I think also it's impossible, it's about the method that we use to approach these recipes. And I would like to show you what is this method. So we start with some assumptions, basically. So we have some textual assumptions that we get some ancient text and interpretation and translations. And then we just start to dig in some evidence that could be factual evidence, so means that already natural science models and the laws and all the knowledge that we have right now and nowadays. Then we just start to thinking about some textual or different recipes that is related with the word or with the passages that we need to try to interpret. Then archaeological hints, some ancient tools, or also all the tools that could be related with the word, and contextual or history part, so trade routes, sociological aspect, rituals, some culture aspect, etc. And those give us factors to narrow on the really accurate way or try to formulate a hypothesis. And this hypothesis, we try to answer different questions. So that could be, what is the purpose of this and how? And once we get this hypothesis in something that we transform in something testable or that we need to measure somehow, we get or we end up in some results that could be new results, something that we are not expected. For example, some comparison with descriptions that we get from ancient text. Also, this result should be repeatable, means that we have replicas and we should end up in the same results, basically. And also their own judgment, as I said, that's a few seconds ago, the judgment of the results, basically in your own judgment or people who knows about this kind of results, like they could judge. And that results leads us in a conclusion. So basically could lead us in a reinterpretation or new concepts, or basically we'd say, okay, it's according to the text says. So it's a reaffirmation of the, let's say, old concept or concept that's already set up during time. So I'm going to show you basically with this method with an example. So we start, for example, with a Greek word, which I I don't know how to pronounce it, so but it means boil. So we just try to looking for all the context about this, what's related with the word. So we start what kind of materials we're going to boil. So for example, we could get oil. So we know by the literature that the oil has a boiling point of, let's say, 260 according to the oil, of course, but with, let's say, olive oil. So we need to differentiate it. What is boil? So boil could be like the boiling point when the equilibrium of liquid and the gas phase is reached. So means that it's start to boiling, like when you put it in water and boil. The context in a different text, so that could be mean probably not boiling, like I said, it should be probably cooking. So what is the difference of concept of boiling means? And what kind of tools that give us a hint about to set up a temperature, for example. So we have a hint of in descriptions in different texts about double vessel. So means that the temperature at this moment was set up by water because it's like a water bath. So means that the maximum temperature that you could have is 100 degrees. So means that the boiling point possibly is not boil the oil as itself. This could be just cooking, but we don't know. However, when you put this oil in for a long time in a huge temperature, you could expect some oxidation, for example. You could expect the rancidity of the oil. And you start to measure antioxidant activity or oxidation activity, ransimat or something, a method that able to measure rancidity of the oil. And you expect that, but at the end you end up that is not. There is no oxidation. So as a conclusion, you have to reinterpret that, and you end up in another hypothesis. The question here is how you could apply this method in the reconstruction of a perfume recipe. So I would like to show you the Succinum perfume case. And this Succinum it's a famous lily-based perfume in the times of Greek ancient times and Greek Roman ancient times. And there's several recipes are well preserved. This Succinum perfume, but the Scottish has a really well described perfume. So that's why we just choose this one to start into this. So I'm going to just take a few seconds to read something that you already take a look yesterday in the workshop. I'm going to just read it really quickly. So it's take 9 pounds and 5 ounces of oil, 5 pounds and 10 ounces of calamus, and 5 ounces of myrrh. Mix them with fragrant wine, and after boiling, strain the oil. Then pour it over 3 pounds and 6 ounces of ground cardamom that has been soaked in rainwater. Let it sit for a while and then press out the liquid. So this is normally the steepest process that shared with not only this recipe, is shared with any other recipes that according to the text says to make the oil more receptive for the main ingredient. Could be flowers, could be any herbal, etc. Also, another recipe says, or another interpretation for stipsis, what it is to thick the oil. So I'm going to just break down this formula or this process in 3 main steps. So basically, we have a pre-soaked 2 raw materials in fragrant wine. Then it's going into the hot process with oil, basically, and boil it. And after that, we just taking back the oil and put it on the cardamom already pre-soaked and pre-soaked. So mean it's filtration and soaked, basically. So that leads us in a huge number of variables that we need to take in account. So we need to take in account mere varieties, for example, how the calamus it is, for example, if it's dry or if it's fresh. Different kind of wines. If we're going to wine, it's a huge number of wine, the type, the region, the color, the yeast that they use for the wine, etc. So we need to define basically different kind of recipe, different kind of raw materials, temperature, volumes, and another types of raw materials, etc. So that gives us a huge number of combination after that, like almost 80 million. And then if you want to be accurate with your results, you should do it by replicate, right? So at least triplicate. So you end up in almost 54 millions. So it's really impossible to make up. I mean, I need to graduate it. I need to make my PhD. And at the end, the president, and the text started with some Greek words. With the translation or interpretation, it's a different verbs. So soak, add, macerate, boil, and thicken it. So what is the evidence we have? So we have some facts. For example, myrrh, in that case, on the first step, which is soaked with fragrant wine. So Myrrh has in the major compounds, we're going to focus on the major compounds. So they have an alcohol soluble material, water soluble material, which is basically sugars, and around a small percent of essential oil. The text says that the physical descriptions or raw materials, we already end up in the problem that Sean told us, the problem with the physical description of the raw materials in ancient time. So, but also we have, again, the perfumer's vessel, which is the double boiler. So we already know that about the existence of the water as a set up the temperature for cooking or for boiling. We have also some hints of the press using at the times to pressing liquids or mixtures. And also the problem is the timing. So to set up the timing, it's kind of complicated. So we have different contexts and try to looking for about how these people try to keep in timing and or to count the hours and the moment. We know that probably the maximum it's 100 minutes according to the seasons, and so according to the sundials and water clocks, it's probably a maximum 100 minutes, but we say 60 minutes. So we just match it like in a puzzle, try to match it all these facts and these assumptions that we're going to have. So the purpose to solve something, it could be even extract or dissolve components. So we're going to assume here that the wine is just a solvent to give us the possibility to extract or dissolve some components, and the major components are in Myrrh, in this case on the resin, and hydration of the dried raw materials in case of calamus, for example. To add to macerate means that you are going to add something, or you could also add something to write off or take off different components that you don't need it in oil, for example, or in the matrix or your carrier. Also, you could add volatile organic compounds to round it or to push the olfactive profile in the perfume. And to boil something as a process that helps us with the temperature to extract metabolites, also to give us a different or could trigger different chemical composition or different chemical reactions, end up in a different kind of compounds that we doesn't have it at the beginning, change the concentration of molecules which help in antioxidant activity. So at the end we start with this. So we just try to simplify the best that we can, the model, to put it on the lab workable or doable. So we have wine, a model solution of wine, basically water and ethanol, 12%, Myrrh coming from Myrrh, and all these variables that give us basically in 84 experiments, that's doable. So at the end, as a result of that, we have an antioxidant activity. We just measured total polyphenol content by Follen-Chicolteau test. And so the olive oil has a huge quantity of acid like oleic acid and so on, but also minor compounds that is polyphenols that it's related with the antioxidant activity. So as you can see here, except this outlier of 10 minutes, the content of polyphenol is still kind of constant. So we could say that it's not changing during this in the maximum 60 minutes of heating of 100 degrees. Also, we have fatty acid methyl ester profile, so by GCMS. So we have here, it's almost constant, again, the concentration. So that's also important to say that it's not oxidation, the acid compounds in the oleic acid, in the olive oil. And also we measure the viscosity. And so just to have a rough idea, so the water is thin, we saw that. And something that is super thick is the honey. Olive oil is in the middle at 25 degrees. So the first bar is the olive oil standard. And as you can see, there is also no difference detectable by the human eye in the experiment at the end. The volatile organic compounds we also measured. So we have the blue chromatogram is the olive oil without any heat treatment. So you could see some different small peaks here. And then we get already heat with the model solution of wine, and almost everything is gone. So you cannot feel the odor of olive oil after boiling. So once you start to add different kind of raw material, you start to increase and push different compounds like eucalyptol and camphor, which comes from basically from cardamom and calamus. So the Ceranea perfume is this yellow one, and you can see the huge peak of eucalyptol and a huge peak of camphor that basically comes from cardamom and calamus. So with that, I will conclude that is not observable change of viscosity. So stepsis is not a process to thick the oil. So we don't know what does it mean. but we know that it's not for that. We not observe any change of in the molecules of involved in the antioxidant activity. And the only thing that we observe until right now is enrichment of the volatile compounds in the oil. Probably a new reinterpretation should be considered. And with that, I would like to conclude as a challenge. We have a huge number of variables, so it means it's impossible to handle it. And also, the target is not well defined. So, because the judge of the perfume is good or not is always relies on us and on own perceptions. What can we do is simplify the number of variables to try to make the experiment possible and corroborate your hypothesis as accurately as possible to be able to reproduce your results. With that, I would like to thank to my supervisors, especially Shan, and the team of Alchemists of Sense and the team of Colloquia Ceranea to give us the opportunity to give it this small talk. And of course, all of you for your kind attention.
And now we have our last speaker of the session, Katarzyna Gromek. She is joining us online. Katarzyna has a lot of experience in recreations of different perfumes. This time she will show us a recreation of Metrodora's fragrance and its Descendants, but she has also worked on a number of other different perfumes from ancient China and many different other regions. So without further ado, Katarzyna, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank the organizer for putting together another great event, and I hope for another one next year. So today, the story will be about my exploration of Metrodora. So Metrodora, she's described as an early Byzantine female physician, and her work on female diseases contains 3 recipes for fragrance products, only 3. And I'm using the Greek and the Italian translation from 1953. And we have here a perfume that is a form of deodorant. We also have 2 incense blends. We don't really have any information if these incense blends are medicinal in nature, or they are just for pleasure, or they are for fumigation of interiors. We don't know. We also don't really know exactly what is the dating of the text. I mean, I've seen dating as early as late 5th century and as late as 10th century. So actually we have some kind of a choice what ingredients we're going to use for the reconstruction. Another point is that actually there is no really reconstruction, as I think several speakers told before. There is really only approximation of very subjective interpretation. It can happen that the scribe, the copies introduced changes because they felt that they were more current with what they knew. The ingredients can be pretty much, we cannot identify every single ingredient, or we have too many candidates for a single aromatic. Like the Storax, it might be over-harvesting, loss of its traits. We don't really know. Genetics is trying to actually find some of the questions like how plants change over millennia, but it's still in the infancy. There is commercial availability of ingredients and also the cost, especially for independent scholar. Then we don't also have the full knowledge of how to prepare the fragrant products. And also, we still can obtain valuable information about practical aspects of how we use the fragrances, even if this is just approximation. We are trying our best. We'll start with the recipe number 56, which is the one for the deodorant. So it's a very simple one. We have dried rose buds, we have pure myrrh, rhizomes of iris or olive, fragrant wine as a binder, and we pretty much make them into powder and mix them with wine to form tablets. And then for the actual use, we soak this little tablet in wine and then spread immediately after a bath. So most likely when the skin is still moist. And this is my interpretation. So we have the buds and rows of petals, and I was using the Rosa centifolia for this interpretation. We have also the hybrid of Iris germanica. I was using 2 different types of myrrh because we don't really know what was available, like where did particular physician actually obtain the myrrh. So I was using the Smyrna and the traditional myrrh, Commiphora myrrha. And also wine. I'm using a sweet Malvasia type wine that is very fragrant because this is what all the recipes mention, that the wine is supposed to be sweet smelling and very fragrant. So pretty much in this recipe, the wine is used as a binding agent, and actually it makes sense because it's very easy later on to soak the tablet and make them soft before actual use. So you can see here this ready tablet is soaking before we use. Also, because the binder, the paste is very kind of a wet. So in order to prevent molding before storage, they have to be well dried to prevent mold infestation. I have actually a few batches that went bad because I was not careful enough to like turn over the little cakes to let them dry on all sides. Now I know better, and actually I have some of those batches from 2021 and they're still fragrant. Okay, so Metrodora recipes were not kind of in a vacuum. They actually existed within an earlier and later recipes. And if we look into the 1st century, into the Materia Medica by Dioscorides, we have an early relative, the Rhodides discs, the little beads that were used for necklaces. And the original recipe called for fresh rose petals, Indian nut, and myrrh, but there is a note that actually some added costus and rhizomes of iris to make them more fragrant. There were 2 different binders, fragrant wine and prepared honey. And actually it makes sense because you want to be able to actually pierce the little beads to put them on a thread and wear as a necklace. And this was worn especially by women as a fragrant necklace to replace the flower wreaths, to cover the stench of sweat, but also the beads were ground into post-bath powders, so most likely also like dusting powder. There is a question of identity, really, what costus is. I am all for Indian Gomia costus because I actually obtained some of the rhizomes of Costus arabicus and Costus speciosus, and none of them is fragrant. They have no any pleasant odor. It's just kind of a soil. And I also recreated them, and I was using a 50% scale because this recipe is suggesting that it was like a kind of a very large batch for multiple users. So actually, I was making it in the winter, and I tend to preserve fresh rose petals in season, either by salting or by sugaring them, so I can actually have access to fresh rose petals all year round. This is a completely 16th century technique, but it works well for providing me access to fresh petals all year round. I also use the Indian nard, and I was actually using the aerial part, the twigs, the leaves, not the rhizomes. Then the myrrh, costus, and the orris root. I was also using honey from Crete, that was thyme honey, that was cooked on low fire to evaporate water and make sure that there is very low concentration of water in it to prevent spoilage. And I was using a Falernian type wine. It's an old type of very sweet, nice smelling wine. And what you do, you pretty much powder all the ingredients. This is the preserved rose petals. It looks nasty, but it smells divine. And then those little discs, and according to Lily Beck translation, they're supposed to be actually more like a flat kind of a bead, flattened discs. And this is how they look when they're actually ready. This is my experiment. During the beginning of reopening after the COVID-19 lockdowns in 2020, I was actually wearing those as a necklace together with fake coral to prevent plaques and everything. So I was wearing them daily over 2 months of the summer. And after this 2 months, they still retain odor, especially when they're warmed by the closeness of the skin. So actually those beads are surprisingly very stable, even with use. Of course, you can always crush them and refresh them if you want. The last iteration of this recipe, we have actually in the 13th century remedy from John the Physician Therapeutics. And we have several recipes that actually, they have like very few ingredients. It's, for example, liquid astringent. It can be actually some of these prepared oils that have very astringent qualities compared to like fresh or raw oil. And you mix it with myrrh, with wine, and apply to the armpits. And the other one is myrrh and cardamom, also mixed with good wine and applied to armpits. And here we also have a lead compound, litharge, and it makes sense because especially heavy metals prevent the growth of microorganisms. So especially for armpits, it makes sense. The next is the incense blend number 57. And this one calls for equal parts of nard, cassia, aromatic reed, so this is the calamus, cyperus, saffron and or costus, frankincense and myrrh, styrax, we don't know what it is, dried grape with seeds removed. Again, we have a sweet smelling wine as a binder and good honey. And again, we grind everything to powder, pass it through a sieve, add the liquid, and make those incense pellets or cakes. And when it is necessary, we place them at what we think is probably hot coals and burn. This and/or is because when I started, I was looking mostly at the Italian translation, but then I started looking later on the actual Greek text. So my first version was made with less ingredients than the actual recipe called for. And you can see this concentrated honey. It has to be actually warm up in order to be liquid again. Otherwise, it's pretty much solid after this preparation. And I was using liquid amber orientalis as my Styrax for the simple reason that it appears in the archaeological samples from like Bronze Age. It must have been more spread out than we actually think. And besides, I like the smell. I mean, I could as well use some more rare type of myrrh. And then the second version that I did, that's more closer to the original recipe, was made with all the ingredients above, and addition of saffron and myrrh. And here are the raisins soaking in Malvasia wine. We have here the costus, nutgrass, cinnamon cassia, and the Styrax. It's kind of looking slightly whitish because I was kind of crushing it in order to get to smaller chunks. And the binders, the fragrant wine and honey, and the rule is the less binders you add, the better quality you actually get. Otherwise, it's too sweet. And then we have another recipe. This is the blend number 58. And this one calls for the caryophyllum, 1 ounce, cassia, 2 ounces, myrrh, 4 ounces, roses, 4 ounces, ammonium, 4 ounces, calamus, 1 ounce, leaves of costus, 1 ounce. And then as a binder, it calls for the balsam. And here we are coming into some issues. My first version was actually made with carnations flowers. So it's hard to tell. So we may assume that cloves maybe were traded, especially in large cities, but not necessarily it was a very popular. There are some, for example, from the Merovingian kingdom, there is a little kind of a not pomander, some kind of a reliquary with a few pieces of cloth that's I think dated to like 6th, 7th century. So maybe cloths were present, but actually carnations are very well known, and they're also having very similar odor. So my first interpretation was made with carnation, and when I later actually repeated the same process, so this is actually testing my Roman mortarium that was made as for me for grinding some of the softer ingredients. Actually, this version with carnations, it's much more pleasant after maturing than the version that's made with cloves. And again, I was using the method of soaking cardamom in hot water because it seems like it's working better than cold water, especially if you want to extract the scent and also get rid of a little bit of the camphorous note because sometimes it's too much. Version 2 was made with black cardamom. So I looked through several books. It was like a process, and I found out that it looks like actually the black cardamom will be more suitable as ammonium. I also added cloves, and this time for the binders is balsam. We assume that balsam, this is the Commiphora galiedensis. This will be pretty much the macerate of the resin in oil like the moringa oil. What I used was actually Atlas mastic liquid resin. I could also use some prepared oil as a binder. And I made a very, very tiny batch because I don't have a lot of this Atlas mastic. And actually this version is kind of a very spicy, and it reminds me of some of the Indian recipes. And if we think about what kind of a binders were actually used, if we go back a few hundred years into the Hippocrates of Cos timeline, and on the disease of women, we have several fumigations for treatment of wandering womb, so the wandering womb in women, that was causing all kind of issues and diseases. We actually have recipe for fumigation that either use some kind of a resin that's liquidified as a binder, or we actually use like a rose unguent or rose oil like rodinon. like in this example. So probably the idea of using balsam, a liquid, for a binder in Metrodora incense was also coming from this tradition. If we look into the forward, I decided to skip use of amida because of all the ambergris and musk and just go ahead a little bit further to Paulus Egineta. We have two recipes for suffimentum or incense, and actually they're not only incense, but they're also a compound ingredient for making antidotes. Again, you can see that many of those ingredients are actually repeating itself, but we also have new introductions, like for example, they are just appearing like the prepared oniha, of the little opening, the coverings of the shell of the marine snails. We also have oak moss and labdanum resin. In this case, myrtle as a replacement for the opobalsamum, because again, it's not commercially available, and we don't even know what was used in the 6th, 7th century. Most likely it was some kind of other species of myrrh. Definitely this is suggested by Paulus Egineta himself, because many of those ingredients were not available, were too expensive, it was out of season. So the authors of all the medical texts started to add like addendum at the end in describing what you can substitute for what. So he suggested myrtle, I used myrtle. And this is the little pellet. And there is another for the lily incense from the same text by Paulus Egineta. And again, it calls for wine as a binder. This one is a little bit kind of a drier one, but it still actually keeps very well. Though I have to say that the Suffimentum rosatum is much longer lasting. And again, in blue, we have the ingredients that were also used by Metrodora recipes. And if we go further, we are getting more and more complicated recipes. This is the pretty much 13th century Nicolaus Myrrh's recipe for incense as made in the Holy City. Who knows what Holy City he means, but it's actually very pleasant. It's very complicated recipe because we are getting more and more exotic imported ingredients like arnabo and bdellium. But if you look, we actually have still rose, nard, cassia, castus, myrrh. They are this kind of a classical ingredients for the Metrodora recipes. And I mentioned that the version of Metrodora recipe that was made with cloves, it reminded me a lot about this kind of a spicy recipes that were used in India. These are pretty much concurrent, they are contemporary with Metrodora. They are coming from a text, Brah Saknita by Varamihira, and those actually don't share a lot of ingredients because those are very rich in the deer musk that doesn't really appear in Metrodora. We also have camphor. We have Drepalanos borneol camphor. This is the Drepalanos aromatica camphor. We also have turpentine from the fragrant cedar. So they pretty much only share things like cassia and myrrh, and this is pretty much all, but still they're very kind of a spicy and camphor scent. So adding cloves to this Metrodora recipe turns them into much more kind of an exotic recipe. And I'm wondering if cloves were really available and they were using cloves, did they ever have any ability to actually see or smell any of those exotic ready products coming from India? We know from one example in Athun in France that was a 4th century vase with something that most likely was reminding an Gallia. So this is an Arabic kind of a compound aromatic mix with ambergris. So the question is, if things were traveling around, the question is if the ready products were also traveling, not just the raw ingredients. And I'm about to close, so what I want to say, that the approximations of Metrodora fragrances are actually quite pleasant to modern nose, maybe with the exception of the clove incense because it's kind of a very, very intense. And actually, I put a little bit of my own creativity into choice of the ingredients, but I think that even the physicians who are making, or maybe the housewives who are mixing this incense blends, they actually have some degree of freedom in choosing what ingredients they're using based on what was available in a given part where they're living and what the budget allowed them for. And actually, I tested the deodorant cakes, and I have to say that I was surprised that I didn't feel like this kind of a sticky feeling that you may expect from a wine and aromatics mixed together. It's very easy to dust off any pieces of the aromatics left on the skin. And I have a lot of people requesting this for summer camping events to refresh the body. So this is a excellent event. Those fragrances were actually anchored between antiquity and early medieval period, and those descendants actually are present as recipes in various medical texts, and I'm still looking for more as I try kind of go through what's available online, the new texts. Thank you for your attention. I have a little movie, but I think I'm going to skip it to save on time.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. I would like to invite Sean and Laura back. And Katarzyna, please also join us in the discussion. So since we are about half an hour late, I would say we keep the discussion relatively brief. We don't want to let Sally wait too long. And here is already the first question by Alan.
Thank you. Thank you for the papers. And there is a striking convergence about the difficulty of doing that. I just want to make some very short comments and about Styrax. Sean, I think I might have a piece of Styrax. Another one. My mother was a pharmacist. She studied immediately after World War II, and at that time, the pharmacists were also pharmacognosist. And she gave me before dying, let's say, she gave me a tin box, the biscuits, the tin box of the 50s, in which there is all her drug store. And I think I Storax.
Okay, I'm gonna visit.
Let's say, there are two things. First, I need to find the box. Because I don't know where it is. I don't see the question, but I don't know where. And second, I need to be sure that there is Styrax in it. But more seriously, you are totally right. It's like a monopoly going through the literature. And so you will think that you are making progress, you buy a hotel, and then you immediately after that, you get to jail, and you have to go back and restart. So it's exactly the point. 3, majority doesn't know all the plants he talks about.
Yeah.
I would even say the opposite. And the proof of that is that when he moved from the small illustration to the full page illustration, very often it was just the cell picture, which he made a mirror image, splitting them and enlarging them. So we shouldn't trust it. That's a really significant. And then the last observation, going back to the monopoly thing, the jail and all the things, you probably should check the publication of Kirsch, Alexander Kirsch, who was a professor of pharmacognosy in Bonn. And his idea was to work on the ancient text and to source his drugs in the Middle East. And I know for sure that he was interested in these kind of drugs. I have read a lot of him. Right now, I don't remember specifically about Styrax, Storax, but it might be a good source.
Thank you.
But I mean,
Okay, I've got like one remark on the reconstructions that we are relying on the very pure compounds. You said about boiling the oil, and I believe there's precisely what Professor Langen's Principio was talking about thickening the oil. And he was just like, it was the same route as you did. And finally, he came up with the solution that the oil, the person who was making it was like, let's say, contaminated with water because it was pressed and it wasn't pressed.
And it made a formation.
And it had to be boiled in order to get rid the water inside. So then you get just like pure oil. And he precisely mentioned that situation and that solution. And once he just boiled the oil with water, it all.
He tried to boil regular oil, and it will boil and evaporate about 300 degrees, which is almost burning. But since he realized that the ancient oil will be not dehydrated, it will be impurified with water, then it will start evaporating under 100, and the whole procedure works. But since you have a pure oil, you cannot evaporate or thicken it. Thickening the oil doesn't evaporate; it
Why-
starts burning. So that might be just the case, and we had a similar one.
And yeah, the other one like situation is with honey. In theory, we had to use like a meridesfumatum. So we had to like get the floating thing or to boil all the things from honey. And the problem is when you use commercial honey right now, it's totally clear and totally pure, and you don't know where to stop the heating.
You don't get the pulp.
So you just boil it up to 100 degrees. I was lucky enough to find the wild tree honey, which had some tiny particles of wax. And they became crucial because when I was heating slowly the honey, about 48 degrees internal temperature of honey, a flotation started. So I could despumate the honey without overheating it. It was crucial because the microorganisms inside survived. And so the fermentation bacteria was possible. So sometimes we just rely too heavily on very pure ingredients and compounds.
Yeah, may I just respond really quickly, just in the interest of time, and then I'll let Laura respond to this. Just because, so I completely agree. Ingredients now are going to be of a very different purity from ingredients before, and in addition, the words that we're trying to understand are often polysemous. They mean many things. Stipsis does not mean only thicken. It doesn't even seem to mean at all thicken. And Alain's got a great article on this. It's so in these cases, the best thing to do is to try all of those options. So we don't try to interpret the word, but we see what happens with a wet oil, what happens with a dehydrated oil, what happens with impure ingredients, what happens with pure, and test all of those things. But then we run into
18 million options.
then we run into Laura's problem. Yes, exactly. No, but that's tricky.
Right, and I think that you point something really important, which is try to looking for the critical factors in your process, right? So, for example, in our case, honey was just for coat the amphora or the container, the jar to store the perfume, but is not involved in the hot process. So and also for the oil, we just realized that when you heat up too much, for example, with let's say this model solution with oil, we just end up in an emulsion that is really complicated. And then the problem, you cannot when you put it salt after the old process. After all, you could split this emulsion, but it's really complicated after that. So before that, so it's like, so that's mean that we need to heat until 100 degrees. That's maximum one, but probably it's just not, I mean, we don't have the answer, of course, but this is, it's a complicated to say that it's a duration of the oil probably. And so that's like so we don't see any thick of oil with when you mix water and oil and on this regard. But probably the time of the time of boiling, right? So Theophrastus says that it's 10 days. It was Theophrastus, I don't remember. As 10 days of boiling oil, 10 days and 10 nights, and then you end up in a really oxidated oil, translucid, but really with a lot of notes. And that possibly is not. It's not.
Is it possible that they did it that way? I mean,
we don't know
Yeah.
exactly. We don't know, but other recipe says that it's only a short time. So that's the problem.
Silver Kings is waiting.
Could I just ask Sean for a couple of clarifications? Hi, Sean. One is Styrax officinalis. That is a plant, I take it. It's on Wikipedia and all that sort of thing. can you say whether the plant is, how is it like a quince tree? What Dioscorides looked at things, how is it like a quince tree? And the second question is, what does stipsis mean, literally something astringent? Is that essential to it?
First question, Styrax officinalis. Yeah, it's a tree, and it has leaves that resemble the quince. That's the early modern interpretation. Pliny also makes the same claim, but Pliny goes a bit further and say that the tree itself just resembles the quince, and the way it's understood is to mean leaves. Your guess is as good as mine as to what looks like or what seems to be like means in Dioscorides, and that would probably be a nice PhD to just look at what the echoes in the Dioscorides. And in terms of stipsis, I won't come down on that. Stipsis obviously comes from the same root word to mean astringent. Stufane is to be astringent or to make astringent. What astringency means, I mean, are we just talking about the mouthfeel? Are we I mean, so it's as soon as you start to unpack these terms, they start to become more and more nebulous and less open to interpretation. But stufane means to make or to be astringent, yeah. And so stipsis would be that process of being made astringent.
So could your process be exactly that? Could you end up with a product that is not thickening, but becomes astringent when at the beginning it wasn't?
Well, yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, it probably does have some more astringent tannins and stuff like this. I mean, even omphacinone on its own, the olive oil that's used in perfume making in most medical sources is used precisely because it's already astringent. That's what they say, and so astringency has some meaning for them. We also find stipsis used, and this is something we've been working on. It's also used in all the alchemical texts. And it's used as an initial stage in alchemical processing of dyes, and it's typically the word used for mordanting. And so stipsis is the mordanting process. So it's not simply about making something astringent, but it's about making something sticky. It's about giving it teeth so that it holds on to something. Because when you dye a cloth, if you don't mordant it first, the dye will simply leak out after you wash it. Mordanting makes sure that you form a complex, and that in their terms, that, as you know, this is also in Alain's article, that you get these pores that things can go into and that they don't leave, so it holds on to them. So there's a chemistry here in these terms that aren't simply conveyed by the sensory terminology, because they're theorized. And I don't know if you went to the perfume maker if he would say I'm doing a stipsis, but if you went to the pharmacist, they might. This is a question. I don't know, because we don't have their texts, but I guess that's how I would answer that. I mean, I'm as confused as I was at the beginning about this.
Thank you.
I do think that the essence of getting, I don't know how to test for astringency. I make a suggestion that you probably know, that the whiskey industry in Scotland has developed, or one of our colleagues at the University of Glasgow has developed an e-tongue, electronic tongue that is used by the whiskey industry. And don't ask me how it works, but in a sense, they can, rather than having people doing the tests, they have the electronic tongue doing the tests. So at some stage, I've asked him if he could do an e-tongue for astringency, because I had a whole host of minerals, and I didn't want to put them in my mouth and test them. But I think there is a room there for something, perhaps development of an e-tongue for particular types of materials, because astringent materials are so repeated in medical texts, and they come from all sources, organic, inorganic. It will be interesting to have that. But I've never heard of stipsis as thickening.
Stipsis is thickening is the default translation, and it goes back all the way to the commentaries by Cornarius on Aetius and Galen. So it's been around for forever.
I have a question for Laura. So have you actually tried to smear a little bit of prepared oil on your hand to see how it feels?
Yeah.
Because what I found out with oils like unprepared and prepared oil, and it was true for olive oil and almond and the moringa oils, that they are actually kind of a feeling, you feel how the skin is kind of a tight, like it's really astringent. And this was supposed to be the characteristic of medicinal oils, that they were kind of a tightening the skin. And
Well,
there is actually this feeling, and I have several people who tested the oils, and they all complain that when they use it on skin, that it's kind of a tightening the skin to the point of over drying it.
it's well known that olive oil at itself is a good exfoliant for the skin. It's a really it's used nowadays in modern cosmetic as a personal care carrier, and so very well for skin, for exfoliant. I just tried the soothing perfume in my hand after that, and what the thing that we could see is the odor. So they could. I don't like this word in perfumery, which is fixed, the odor. But it's like we have more base notes in the perfume that gives you like a long lasting of the sensory part, or the long lasting of the perfume. So it means that the perfume could be still in the skin for more, let's say, like long time, like more than 6 hours, or like this. So this is my personal experience. I need to and it should be really, it's gonna be heard really bad, but I'm going to use my sensory panel, already trained to do this. It's a sensory test to try to looking for the long lasting in the for a period of 6 and 8 hours, to looking for this results, basically.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for this comment and the outside. So maybe let's complete the discussion. We can like go on and on, but the time is passing and no sun is